They told her she would gain a name, a title, and security. They neglected to mention she would lose her peace. Welcome, dear readers, to He Asked for My Hand, but Not My Heart. For fans of Bridgerton and Pride and Prejudice, this is the story of Miss Charlotte Whitmore, a woman who sacrifices her dream of love to save her family, and Lord Nathaniel Ashbury, the brooding Viscount who offers her everything but his heart. What begins as a cold, polite transaction soon ignites into a desperate, consuming passion neither of them can control. Get ready for a slow-burn romance where duty meets devastating desire. If you love tales of emotional depth, brooding heroes, and heroines who refuse to wilt, do ensure you subscribe now so you never miss a moment of this heart-wrenching journey. The carriage is pulling away. Let the story begin. Chapter 1. A Proposal of Convenience. The ruin did not arrive with a thunderclap or the shattering of glass, but with the quiet, devastating finality of a banker's letter. Miss Charlotte Whitmore read the precise, chilling script twice, seated primly in the sun-drenched, yet threadbare morning room of Heathfield Hall. Outside, the roses were a riot of summer pinks, oblivious to the fact their roots might soon belong to a stranger. It was not a question of if their father's reckless debts would swallow the estate. It was only a matter of when. "He has lost it all, hasn't he, Lottie?" Eleanor, her younger sister, all bright, naive youth and untroubled curls, whispered from the doorway. Charlotte folded the letter with meticulous care, tucking it back into the envelope, as if containing the words could somehow contain the catastrophe. "Not yet, Ellie, but the window is closing, and Papa is too far gone in his denial to even see the sash." Their father, Mr. Whitmore, was not a villain, merely a man fatally charmed by the false promises of fortune and the company of other men more dissolute than himself. His only legacy, it seemed, would be the swift, ignominious descent of his family from respectable gentry to utter destitution. Charlotte was 23, past her first blush, and knew what society expected of her: to marry well and swiftly. She had always held out for affection, for the gentle romance she saw in the poetry she kept hidden beneath her mattress. Now she held out only for salvation. "We shall be cast out," Eleanor fretted, her voice trembling. "What is to become of us? Of Mamma?" "We shall face it," Charlotte said, though her heart was a cold, tight knot. "We will find a way. We must." But even as she spoke the bold words, she felt the truth like a physical weight. There was no way. Not one that did not involve either the cold charity of distant relatives or a rapid decline into the murky world of governesses and paid companions. And she could not, would not, allow her sister and mother to suffer that fate. She was the eldest, the shield. It was in this moment of quiet despair, staring out at the doomed roses, that a carriage arrived. It was not their usual dust-covered gig, nor the modest equipage of a nearby neighbor. This was a statement of profound wealth, a highly polished town carriage drawn by a pair of magnificent bays whose harness glittered and whose very presence seemed to silence the birds in the garden. The footman who descended wore a livery of deep, uncompromising blue, and the man who followed him— "Good heavens," breathed Eleanor, forgetting her fears for a moment. "It is Lord Ashbury." The terms of engagement: Lord Nathaniel Ashbury, Viscount Ashbury, was a man whose reputation preceded him like a shadow. Wealthy beyond measure, reclusive by nature, and utterly unreadable. He had spent the last several years largely confined to his formidable Ashbury Hall, emerging only for the necessary functions of his title, and never for frivolous pleasure. It was whispered in every drawing-room that his heart had been shattered years prior, a fiancé who had caused a great scandal and left him publicly humiliated. He had since carried his stoicism like armor. He entered the drawing-room with the air of a man arriving to dispatch an unpleasant necessity. He did not look at the house, its faded elegance, the desperate effort to conceal the encroaching shabbiness, but directly at Charlotte. Nathaniel Ashbury was handsome in a severe, arresting fashion. His hair was the color of midnight, his features chiseled and sharp, but it was his eyes, gray and utterly devoid of warmth, that held the gaze. They promised competence, reserve. They promised everything except ease. He bowed, a correct, cold inclination of the head to Mr. Whitmore, who had been summoned, trembling, from his study. He did not bother with pleasantries. "Mr. Whitmore," Ashbury said, his voice a low, perfectly modulated baritone that carried a chilling sense of authority. "I understand your current situation is precarious." Mr. Whitmore stammered out a denial, a plea for time. Lord Ashbury merely raised an elegant hand, silencing him. I am aware of the precise figures owed. I have acquired those notes. The debt, sir, is now entirely mine." A stunned silence fell over the room. Eleanor gasped, her small hand flying to her mouth. Charlotte felt a rush of icy clarity. He had not come to demand payment. He had come to negotiate a rescue. Lord Ashbury turned his full, unnerving attention to Charlotte. "Miss Whitmore, I shall be blunt. I require a wife, a respectable, self-possessed woman who will oversee my household, provide me with a tolerable heir, and pose no risk of public scandal." He paused, his eyes traversing her face, assessing her like a piece of property. A fine, if not sparkling, acquisition. "You, madam, are such a woman. I have observed your quiet dignity, the care you take of your family, the absence of any frivolous ambition. The debt on Heathfield Hall and the assurance of your family's continued comfort will be settled in full on the day you become Viscountess Ashbury." Charlotte stood utterly still, her spine straight, refusing to shrink under his gaze. The air seemed thin, pressurized. This was the moment. The exchange of her future, her hope of a joyful love, for the security of those she cherished. He stepped closer, and for the first time, a flicker of something, not emotion, but a stark, brutal honesty, appeared in his eyes. "I must be clear, Miss Whitmore. I cannot offer affection. I am not built for it, nor do I desire it. I seek a partnership of duty and respect. I will offer you my name, my fortune, and my complete loyalty as your husband, but I will not offer my heart. I have none left to give." The words landed not as a cruel blow, but as a sober statement of fact. He had offered her terms, clear and cold as granite. A contract. The color had drained from her face, but she lifted her chin. She saw the despair in her father's eyes, the fear in Eleanor's, and the quiet dignity of her mother, who stood ready to accept whatever sacrifice was required. She took a slow, deep breath, tasting the dust of a ruined dream. "My lord," she said, her voice steady and low, "you seek a guarantee of respectability and an heir. I seek the survival of my family. The terms are understood." Her gaze met his, not yielding, but assessing him in turn. If I must enter a loveless marriage, her look seemed to challenge. I shall not be a broken woman in it. "I accept your proposal, Lord Ashbury." The wedding was, by the estimation of the Morning Post, a triumph of discretion and taste. Lord Ashbury had ensured that every detail was faultless, every societal expectation met with a cool, impersonal perfection. It was held in the private chapel of Ashbury Hall, a magnificent, echoing chamber of stained glass and dark oak. Charlotte wore a gown of heavy cream satin that did not entirely conceal the tremor in her hands. She did not wear white. She had refused to pretend this was an occasion of innocent joy. When she stood before the altar, her new husband stood beside her, his profile a stark, unyielding line. The Reverend's voice was warm, but the words, "to love and to cherish," seemed to crack and freeze in the vast, empty space between them. Nathaniel's hand, when it took hers to place the thick gold band on her finger, was cool and firm. It was the hand of a man accustomed to signing documents of momentous import, not offering a tender gesture. He had promised her his name, and he had given it. The name, Viscountess Ashbury, felt impossibly heavy on her tongue when she repeated her vows. The ceremony concluded. She was married, saved. As they turned from the altar, she instinctively sought his eye, a small, tentative flicker of hope for a connection, for a shared breath of relief that the ordeal was done. But he did not look at her. His gaze was fixed on a point beyond her shoulder, distant and utterly remote. Their marriage had begun precisely as he had promised. Cold, correct, and utterly hollow. Charlotte felt the heavy satin of her gown pressing against a heart that was already retreating, a heart determined not to surrender its dignity, even if it had surrendered its happiness. She walked out of the chapel on the arm of her husband, a woman who had just traded a family ruin for a gilded solitude. The silence between them was the loudest sound in the world. Chapter 2. The Cold Manor. Ashbury Hall was not merely a house. It was a fortress built of history and restraint. Unlike the sun-drenched, if dilapidated, charm of Heathfield, this manor was a Gothic masterpiece of gray stone and impenetrable shadow. When Charlotte arrived as its new mistress, the grandeur was oppressive, the silence profound. It spoke of a wealth so absolute it did not require cheering or conversation, a silence that felt not peaceful but abandoned. The drawing rooms were vast and perfectly maintained, yet they lacked the slightest indication of a human presence beyond the diligent polishing of the staff. The ancestral portraits frowned from the walls, their cold, noble gaze following Charlotte as she walked the endless corridors. She felt less like a bride and more like a highly respected, meticulously catalogued piece of art installed in a gallery. The man who had brought her here was the essence of the manor itself, immense in presence, yet utterly distant. Nathaniel Ashbury was, as a husband, everything he had promised to be: correct, attentive to her physical comfort, and emotionally void. They dined each evening in a magnificent, echoing dining room, a table set for two that could easily accommodate 20. The ritual was agonizing. The footmen moved with hushed reverence, presenting immaculate courses, while Charlotte and Nathaniel exchanged a polite handful of sentences concerning the weather, the estate's yield, or the latest political news, never touching on anything remotely personal. After the strained formality of the meal, Nathaniel would offer her a shallow bow. "Good evening, Charlotte. I trust you will find the library suitable for your reading." He would then retreat to his private study, a heavy oak door closing with a firm thud that felt like the slamming of a final boundary. Charlotte would indeed go to the library, sometimes to read, but often merely to stare at the thousands of unread volumes, symbols of the vastness of the life she now shared with a man she did not know. The arrangement was not a marriage. It was a polite, exquisitely managed separation. It was only through the servants that Charlotte began to piece together the fractured history of her husband. She found an ally in Mr. Alcott, the wizened, taciturn steward, who had served the Ashbury family for 40 years and wore an expression of perpetual, weary concern. "The Viscount is a fine master, my lady," Alcott told her one afternoon, his voice low as he showed her the ledgers. "A fair man, but he never quite recovered from what happened before." The tale, gathered in fragments from Alcott and the loyal housemaids, was heart-wrenching in its simplicity. Nathaniel had once loved deeply, perhaps recklessly. His former fiancée, Miss Selina Davies, had been beautiful, vibrant, and utterly faithless. Weeks before the wedding, she had been discovered in a scandalous liaison with another man, shattering Nathaniel's pride and exposing him to the cruelest mockery of the ton. The humiliation had been complete. He had lost his love, his hope, his faith in the redemptive power of emotion. He built the walls higher around Ashbury Hall and higher still around his heart. He lost his fiancée to scandal, leaving him distrustful of emotion and determined never to love again. Charlotte understood then. His current coldness was not merely a personality trait. It was a profound defensive wound. She was a respectable tourniquet applied to a lacerated heart. Charlotte, however, was not one to wilt under indifference. She was a woman of warmth and quiet dignity, and her spirit rejected the sterile isolation of Ashbury Hall. She had accepted a cold contract, but she refused to live a cold life. She began her campaign of gentle, determined revitalization. First, she demanded the dusty draperies be thrown open, letting sunlight flood the shadowed corridors, chasing out the clinging damp. She ordered the removal of heavy, suffocating velvets and replaced them with lighter, brighter fabrics. She insisted on fresh flowers, cut daily from the glass houses, scattering splashes of defiant color throughout the somber rooms. The most transformative change, however, occurred outside. She ventured into the once magnificent gardens, now tangled and choked with neglect, the living symbol of Nathaniel's emotional withdrawal. Day after day, wearing thick gloves and a plain bonnet, Charlotte worked alongside the head gardener. She reopened the paths, pruned back the rampant overgrowth, and revived the central fountain, which had been silent for years. The physical act of restoring life to the choked earth was deeply satisfying, and soon the empty halls began to fill with life. The servants, long accustomed to their master's melancholic routine, blossomed under her cheerful, appreciative direction. Nathaniel did not miss these changes. He saw the brighter light when he walked to his study. He noticed the scent of honeysuckle where there had once only been the smell of old wood. He saw the renewed vigor in his staff, and most tellingly, he saw Charlotte. He began to take his solitary evening constitutional not on the east wing's gravel path, but on the west, where the restored rose garden was coming into lush, vibrant bloom. He would stand at the edge of the manicured lawn, an utterly still figure framed in the deepening twilight, and watch the new Viscountess Ashbury, his wife, the woman who had asked for nothing but had brought so much, tending to the roses. He watched her quiet strength, her unflagging energy, the ease with which she spoke to the staff, who clearly adored her. He watched the light of her presence begin to fill his shadows. She is an excellent wife, he would tell himself, folding his arms tight against his chest, refusing to acknowledge the dangerous warmth that pricked through his armor. She is merely fulfilling her duty with commendable zeal. Yet, the chill of Ashbury Hall was retreating, slowly, inexorably, around the edges of her influence. Lord Ashbury, the man determined never to feel again, was quietly witnessing the unsettling reality. The cold arrangement he had engineered was beginning to ignite into something far more dangerous than convenience, a love neither of them could yet control. Chapter 3. A Crack in the Walls. Charlotte's relentless, quiet goodness was a pressure that Nathaniel Ashbury was not built to withstand. He could ignore flattery, dismiss manipulation, and withstand ridicule, but he had no defense against sincere warmth. Charlotte did not try to penetrate his shell. She simply behaved with such consistent grace and intelligence that the shell itself began to feel inconveniently heavy to him. She had made his life better. Ashbury Hall no longer felt like a magnificent mausoleum. His food was excellent. His household ran with unprecedented smoothness. And when he saw his wife across a room, her expression was one of dignified calm, not reproach. She was everything a man of his standing could desire in a viscountess, yet she was becoming something perilously close to the woman he desired. The unsettling change culminated on a night when the summer sky broke into a sudden, vicious storm. A wave of influenza had swept through the servants' quarters. Charlotte, with characteristic selflessness, insisted on tending to the afflicted staff personally, dismissing the frantic protestations of the housekeeper. She worked late into the night, administering draughts and cool cloths, refusing to rest until the fever broke in the kitchen maid's small daughter. The following morning, the storm having passed, Charlotte could not rise. The exhaustion of her efforts, coupled with the exposure and worry, had left her severely ill. Her head throbbed, her body ached, and she slipped into a fitful, feverish sleep. The news of the Viscountess's sudden illness reached Nathaniel in his study. It was Mr. Alcott, his steward and only confidant, who delivered the quiet, grave news. Nathaniel's reaction was not immediate panic, but a slow, cold dread that tightened around his chest. He was accustomed to calculating risks. He was wholly unprepared for this blinding fear of loss that had nothing to do with finance or honor. He left his ledgers and proceeded directly to her chambers, the grand appointed room where they had maintained their formal distance. He dismissed the anxious maid and stood at the foot of the magnificent bed, looking down at his wife. Charlotte was pale, her usual self-possessed calm replaced by a vulnerable fragility that pierced his composure like an icicle. Her breathing was shallow. Seeing her so diminished, so near the grasp of something he could not control, tore a raw seam in his carefully constructed apathy. He had married her to save his reputation. Now he realized she was the only anchor to his sanity. He took a chair by her bedside. Forgetting his duty, forgetting his pride, forgetting the bitter memory of Selina, he simply watched her. The night deepened. The moon cast long, ghostly shadows across the room, and still he remained. As the hours bled into the dawn, the fever seemed to retreat. Charlotte stirred, her brow less furrowed. Exhaustion finally claimed Nathaniel, and he leaned forward, resting his head near her hand, his rigid posture finally collapsing. Charlotte woke slowly, the fever having retreated, leaving her weak but blessedly lucid. The first thing she registered was not the scent of the linen or the sound of the house stirring, but a profound, comforting warmth beside her. She turned her head gently and saw him. Lord Nathaniel Ashbury, the brooding, untouchable Viscount, was asleep in the chair, his head resting by the bedside, his dark hair falling forward. His hand, usually so preoccupied with a pen or a ledger, was not merely near hers. It was curled around her own, his long fingers gently interlaced with hers. In sleep, the hard, defensive mask was gone. His features, usually so sharp and stoic, were soft and conflicted, etched not with disdain, but with a palpable weariness and a hint of a deeper, unspoken fear. He looked less like a noble lord and more like a man terribly afraid of solitude. It was their first moment of closeness, born not of passion, but of shared silent vulnerability. A true crack had opened in the formidable wall he had erected. A wave of tenderness, profound and unexpected, washed over Charlotte. She wanted to shift, to wake him, to simply whisper his name, but she feared breaking the exquisite, fragile spell. She lay still, memorizing the feel of his skin against hers, the warmth that seeped into her through their joined hands. But the moment, like all precious things, was fleeting. The weak light of morning strengthened, and a housemaid entered the room with a hushed step. The noise startled Nathaniel awake. His eyes, those distant gray eyes, snapped open. He immediately registered their position, his hand holding hers, his guard utterly down. His entire body went rigid. The softness vanished, replaced instantly by a look of self-reproach and a flash of cold, utter shame at his own tenderness. He withdrew his hand as if burned, standing abruptly. "My lady," he said, his voice clipped and distant once more, the polite stranger returning to the fore, "I am relieved to see your fever has broken. I trust you will remain resting." He did not wait for her reply. With a quick, brusque turn, he retreated, cold once more, ashamed of his fleeting affection. The heavy chamber door closed behind him, leaving Charlotte staring at the space where he had been, a bewildered ache replacing the fever in her heart. He had revealed his fear, and then snatched it back, pulling the armor tighter than before. The delicate, unnerving tension of that night was immediately compounded by a new arrival. Lady Henrietta Ashbury, Nathaniel's disapproving aunt, a woman who viewed all genuine emotion as a vulgar indulgence, arrived to ensure propriety was maintained around the recovering Viscountess. She was soon followed by another, far less welcome guest, Lord Pembroke. Pembroke was a man of effortless charm, known in London for his ready wit and his complete disregard for matrimonial boundaries. He was a notorious rake, yet possessed of a light, disarming touch that made him impossible to hate. He visited Charlotte under the guise of inquiring after her health, but his purpose was quickly evident. He was charmed by her intelligence and her quiet fire, and he pursued her with a graceful, persistent flirtatiousness that Charlotte found diverting, if harmless. Nathaniel, who had been burying himself in his study since the morning after the fever, found himself summoned by a strange, sharp discomfort. He would emerge to find Pembroke seated near Charlotte in the drawing room, their conversation lively, punctuated by Charlotte's genuine ringing laugh, a sound Nathaniel realized he had never heard fully directed at himself. "Your Viscountess has the most exquisite understanding of the classics, Ashbury," Pembroke drawled one afternoon, smiling openly at Charlotte. "A refreshing change from the simpering misses in London." Charlotte blushed, amused. Nathaniel merely gave a tight nod. But he lingered. He stood by the mantel, pretending to read a letter, his jaw clenched so tightly he could taste the bitterness on his tongue. He watched the subtle tilt of Charlotte's head toward Pembroke, the way her eyes sparkled with easy camaraderie. The discomfort swelled into something uglier, something primitive and hot, a jealousy Nathaniel could not hide, and certainly could not understand. He had married her for convenience, had stipulated their loveless contract. She owed him nothing beyond respect. Yet the thought of another man entertaining her, eliciting a warmth he dared not touch, felt like a betrayal. His composure was cracking. He had retreated from tenderness only to be ambushed by an emotion far more destructive to his peace, the fierce, consuming fire of possessiveness. He was terrified of love, but it seemed he was entirely capable of obsession. A crack in the walls, end of part 1. Did you feel that, dear reader? The moment the ice finally fractured, Lord Ashbury may have retreated, ashamed of the tenderness he showed at Charlotte's bedside, but the damage is done. A man who vowed never to feel has just experienced the sharp, unfamiliar sting of jealousy, thanks to the charming Lord Pembroke. Nathaniel's composure is failing, and his restraint is nearly spent. You've witnessed the tense civility give way to a raw, undeniable longing. But this is only part 1. Tune in for part 2, where a country ball will force a confrontation, turning long-held silence into a devastating declaration. Will Nathaniel's fear destroy the love he's fighting to deny, or will Charlotte force him to face the heart he never asked for?